Evolution, Lesson 3.1, Introduction to Evolution. What is evolution? So when you think of evolution, you probably are thinking of when humans evolved from apes and chimps and monkeys and stuff like that. And that's absolutely right. But in this unit, we're going to talk about a little bit more of the technical stuff and what that means. So on November 24th, 1859, that was the day that Charles Darwin, who's a very important man that we'll learn a lot about, published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. The Origin of Species focused biologists' attention on the great diversity of organisms. So in this book, Darwin made sort of two main points that people took away. So the first one is that many current species are actually descendants of ancestral species. So that's sort of where that evolution part comes in that we have all evolved from something. We didn't just appear one day. And then the second one is that natural selection is the mechanism for this evolutionary process. So if you're wondering what natural selection is, you might have heard of something called survival of the fittest. And what this essentially means is those individuals best suited for the environment at that time are more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass on those traits to the next generation. And then over time, the population will evolve to reflect those traits. So before Darwin started creating these things, there was some resistance to evolution, so people then didn't want to believe that it was true. So the sort of three main ones are Aristotle viewed species as fixed and unchanging. And then there was the Old Testament that holds species were individually designed by God and therefore perfect. So like sort of that species only came from God and there had to be no scientific aspect to it. And then the last one is Carolus Linnaeus, who interpreted organismal adaptations as evidence that the creator had designed each species for a specific purpose. So sort of each animal or species, or like the human, had one specific purpose in life. Then this sort of brings us to Lamarck's theory. Lamarck hypothesized that species evolve through use and disuse. So, for example, like sort of the parts that used a lot became a larger and stronger part of that animal's body. So the giraffe's neck, it needed to reach the leaves on the tall trees because where it lived. So it started to get longer. And then the second one is the inheritance of acquired traits. So organisms can pass these traits on to their offspring. So if the organism finds those traits useful, they're obviously going to pass it on to the next generation. Only one of Darwin's predecessors to develop a model of how life evolves, and the mechanisms are proposed were unsupported by evidence. So he didn't really have that much evidence, but it was just his beliefs. So this brings us all the way back to Darwin. So if we think back to what we've just learned about Darwin, we learned about natural selection and the book that he wrote. And over this whole course of him, what he actually did was he studied finches in the Galapagos to sort of understand what this term of evolution and natural selection is. So he sort of took away 5 observations, which are: for any species, population sizes would increase exponentially if all individuals that are born reproduced successfully. Populations tend to be stable in size except for seasonal fluctuations. So sometimes depending on the season, if it's super cold, some animals tend to die off, or if it's super hot, there might be some sort of problem with getting water and stuff like that. 3, resources are limited. 4, members of the population are very extensively in their characteristics. So no 2 individuals look alike. So just like humans, even though I am still a human like my sister, we are very different individuals. And the 5th one is much variation is actually heritable. And then so these 5 observations led to inferences. So some of the inferences were that the production of more individuals than the environment can support can actually lead to a struggle for the existence among the individuals in the population. Another one is that survival depends in part on inherited traits. So individuals whose inherited traits give them a high probability of surviving and reproducing are more likely to leave more offspring than other individuals. And then the third one is that the unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to gradual change in the population, with obviously the favorable characteristics. Then we have artificial selection. So we learned about natural selection, but actually humans do something called artificial selection, which is when humans select and modify other species over many generations. So humans select and breed the individuals with the desired trait that they want. So if you think of things like dogs, so dog breeders, they breed sort of different dogs, obviously because there's sort of things like purebred, and then people consider it to be like a mutt if it's mixed breed. And then artificial selection happens fast or dramatically over a short period of time, whereas natural selection can take over hundreds of years. So these are sort of the main things that we're going to be taking a look at in this unit. So the evidence for evolution. So there's 4 pieces of evidence that sort of Darwin found and everybody sort of collectively came to an agreement on. So that is direct observations of evolution, homology, biogeography, and fossil record. So let's talk a little bit about those. Direct observation of evolution is the ability for an individual to evolve and overcome. So essentially just like sort of the main arching umbrella. And example of this is the evolution of drug-resistant HIV. So this happens over lots of years, and it's essentially what evolution is. Homology is the next one, which is a similarity in anatomy due to a common ancestry. So homologous structures are anatomical resemblances that represent variations in a structure. So before we go on, I just want to point your attention to this picture. So we said it was a similarity in our anatomy due to a common ancestry. So it could sort of be said that humans have a common ancestry with things like a cat, a whale, or a bat. And you can see that all of our sort of limbs, or what each individual would consider their arm, like a human, has all those sort of different parts. So it has like sort of the finger-like things, and then it obviously has that long sort of shoulder part at the top, and then the two, the orange part and the yellow part. So you can see there's sort of that really similar part to each of the individuals because we share a common ancestry. Then we have vestigial organs, which are remnants of structures that did serve a purpose originally to the ancestor, but it's no longer needed. So there's lots of things like that. Sometimes people like to think of originally babies used to have that webbing in the middle of your fingers. So if you spread your fingers apart, you can sort of see you have that webbing, especially near your thumb and your pointer finger. And that it used to be a lot more, and it's just been cut down over the years because humans don't really need it anymore. And then we also have molecular homologies, which are on the molecular level, and these are genes shared among organisms inherited from a common ancestor. The next one is biogeography, which is the geographic distribution of species. So people generally think of things like continental drift or Pangea, when all the continents are sort of one and then they broke apart, or like just a small part of an island sort of broke off, stuff like that. So just sort of an example of this is a similar mammal can be found in 2 different parts of the world, and they share a common ancestry, but they both sort of adapted to their unique environments. So once North America and Australia were connected, and there's this sort of common mammal found in both places, but in Australia it's called a sugar glider because it does certain things that makes it a sugar glider, but its super similar sort of partner is found in North America and is known as the flying squirrel. But they're both essentially the same, they're just adapted to their own places when the world sort of split. And then the last one is fossil record, which is pretty much just the paleontologists finding fossils, and that they support evidence and inferences of major branching off in the tree of life. And the last thing that we're going to talk about is why evolution is not perfect. So evolution is not perfect is because it's limited by historical constraints. Adaptations are compromises. Selections can only edit existing variations, and fate and natural selection interact. And that's it.